French General Etienne Dufour would never forget the whistle that preceded his aide's death. It was a peculiar sound, different from the usual chaos of battle. Sharp, precise, almost surgical. Captain Logan Mercier collapsed from his horse with a perfectly circular hold in the center of his forehead, at a distance no conventional musket should reach with such accuracy. Dufour scanned the oak forest flanking the dusty road through the Sierra de Guadarrama, his trained eyes searching for the telltale smoke of gunfire. Nothing. Only the dancing shadows of the Castilian afternoon and the autumn wind dragging dry leaves. Another whistle. This time the sergeant to his left fell with his throat pierced. The French column of 200 men halted in disarray, soldiers seeking cover behind rocks and trees, their faces showing something Dufour had rarely seen in veterans of Austerlitz and Jena: genuine fear. 3 months earlier, the situation had seemed very different. Marshal Massena had convened his generals at headquarters in Salamanca to discuss a disturbing problem. French patrols were suffering inexplicable casualties in the mountains north of Madrid. These weren't traditional guerrilla ambushes with knives and rusty blunderbusses, but something far more lethal. Reports spoke of marksmen who killed officers at impossible distances with precision that defied all known military logic. Dufour, recently arrived from France with reinforcements, had listened to these accounts with skepticism. The Spanish were brave but disorganized, he thought. Their weapons were inferior, their tactics primitive. Massena, however, showed genuine concern. He had lost 17 officers in the past 6 weeks, all with bullet wounds, suggesting single accurate shots executed by expert hands from distances of 300 meters or more. The origin of the threat. The origin of this deadly threat traced back to the forges of Ripoll in Catalonia, where Spanish master gunsmiths had perfected a technique that would transform the tactical balance of warfare: barrel rifling. While standard French Charleville muskets had smooth barrels that fired spherical balls with unpredictable trajectories, Spanish rifles incorporated helical grooves inside the barrel. These microscopic striations imparted a spinning motion to the projectile, stabilizing its flight and exponentially multiplying effective precision. Antonio Rodriguez, a 52-year-old master gunsmith, had dedicated 20 years to perfecting this art. His workshop in Oviedo produced barely 4 rifles per month, each an individual masterpiece, calibrated with millimetric tolerances, personally tested by the master himself, achieving standards impossible for mass production. The chosen marksman. The rifled muskets reached select hands. Not just any guerrilla could wield them. They required marksmen with years of experience in big game hunting, men who understood wind, gravity, and controlled breathing. Miguel Santana was one of these chosen few. At 34, he had hunted wild boar and deer in the Asturian mountains since age 12, developing an almost supernatural instinct for calculating distances and atmospheric conditions. When war erupted in 1808, Miguel joined the northern guerrilla bands, bringing his old hunting rifle. Soon his skill reached the ears of local commanders. In May 1811, he received one of Rodriguez's rifled muskets, a magnificent weapon with an 80-centimeter octagonal barrel, carved walnut stock, and perfectly balanced 5-kilogram weight. The difference was abysmal. His old rifle was reliable up to 60 meters. Beyond that, the ball could deviate half a meter in any direction. The new rifled musket maintained lethal precision up to 300 meters, and in expert hands like Miguel's, could hit specific targets at 400 meters. It didn't fire common spherical balls, but cylindrical conical projectiles that Rodriguez himself manufactured, each slightly smaller than the barrel's caliber to facilitate loading, but designed to expand with the powder explosion and engage perfectly with the rifling. The loading process was slower, 45 seconds instead of 20 for a conventional musket, but a single shot from the rifled musket equaled 10 shots from a normal musket in terms of hit probability. The forces at play. The forces present in that region in October 1811 reflected the unique character of this war. On one side, Napoleon Bonaparte's French Empire had deployed over 300,000 soldiers in Spain, the largest military concentration Europe had seen. Veterans hardened by campaigns from Egypt to Russia, equipped with the best mass-produced armament of the era, organized in efficient divisional structures supported by mobile artillery and light cavalry. On the other side, Spanish resistance presented a challenge that conventional Napoleonic tactics couldn't resolve. Decentralized guerrillas operating on familiar terrain with total support from the civilian population, capable of appearing, striking, and vanishing like smoke in the mountains. And now, some of these guerrillas possessed a force multiplier no French general had anticipated. Rifles that converted a handful of men into lethal snipers. October 17th, the ambush. The encounter on October 17th was no accident. Spanish spies in Segovia had reported the movement of Dufour's column, 200 infantry, 20 dragoons transporting payroll for northern garrisons, a fortune in gold coins that could finance months of resistance. Miguel and his group of 8 marksmen had studied the route for 2 days, choosing a narrow section of road where centenarian oaks leaned inward, creating a green tunnel, limiting lateral visibility, and forcing the column to advance in tight formation. Positions were selected carefully, between 150 and 250 meters from the route, elevated for optimal shooting angles, with escape routes planned toward natural caves that perforated the mountains. Dawn of battle. The dawn of October 17th was no accident. Spanish spies in Segovia had reported the movement of Dufour's column, 200 infantry, 20 dragoons transporting payroll for northern garrisons, a fortune in gold coins that could finance months of resistance. Miguel and his group of 8 marksmen had studied the route for 2 days, choosing a narrow section of road where centenarian oaks leaned inward, creating a green tunnel, limiting lateral visibility, and forcing the column to advance in tight formation. Positions were selected carefully, between 150 and 250 meters from the route, elevated for optimal shooting angles, with escape routes planned toward natural caves that perforated the mountains. Tactical preparation. Tactical preparation began when the gray dawn light permitted terrain recognition. Miguel gathered the group on a rocky outcrop with complete view of the target road, deploying a crude map drawn on goat skin, marking positions with charcoal. The strategy was clear, but required absolute discipline. Each marksman would have a specific responsibility zone. Miguel, as the most experienced shooter, would target the French commander, identifiable by his dark blue uniform with golden epaulets and bicorn hat. Juan and Pedro would aim for secondary officers. The other 5 would eliminate sergeants and corporals, identifiable by their stripes and position in formation. The objective wasn't to annihilate the entire column, impossible with only 8 rifles, but to decapitate its command structure, create panic, and during the subsequent chaos, other guerrillas with conventional weapons would attack from closer positions to capture the treasure. The paradox of Spanish forces. The conditions of Spanish troops in this phase of the war were paradoxical. On one hand, disorganization was endemic. There were no regular Spanish armies capable of facing the French in pitched battle after the disasters of 1808–09. Guerrillas lived as fugitives, sleeping in caves and forests, feeding on what sympathetic peasants could share or what they stole in raids. Many wore rags, their original uniforms long destroyed, replaced by patched civilian clothes. Disease was common: dysentery, typhoid fever, infections from poorly treated wounds. Desertion was constant: men who disappeared during the night, tired of a seemingly endless war. But those who remained possessed something no French military manual could quantify: absolute knowledge of terrain, unshakable motivation to defend their land, and now, in select cases, technologically superior weapons to those of the invader. The technology. The rifle Miguel caressed was more than a weapon. It represented centuries of Spanish artisanal tradition applied to emerging ballistic science. Antonio Rodriguez, his creator, had studied similar designs that sporadically appeared in Europe since the 15th century. Germans had experimented with rifling since 1498, but artisanal production limited their use to expensive ceremonial or hunting weapons. Rodriguez had solved the critical problem: how to create consistent rifling without industrial machinery. His technique involved a mandrel with helical wedges that, carefully hammered from inside the heated barrel, engraved 6 perfectly spaced spiral roofs. Each rifle required 80 hours of manual work. The rifling completed 1 full rotation every 70 centimeters, imparting approximately 3,000 revolutions per minute to the projectile during flight. This gyroscopic rotation stabilized the bullet against air irregularities, converting a random shot into an instrument of precise death. The weight. Toward 9 a.m., Spanish observers sighted the characteristic dust cloud of a column on the march. Miguel ordered absolute silence. The men adopted final positions. Each marksman had constructed a small parapet of stones and branches during the night, barely visible from below, but sufficient to conceal the flash of firing and provide stable support for the rifle.
Miguel calculated mentally. The column advanced at standard march speed, 3 kilometers per hour. They would take 12 minutes to reach the kill zone. He verified his rifle one last time. Powder in the chamber, compacted but not excessively to permit uniform ignition. The greased cylindrical conical projectile descending through the barrel until seated on the leather wadding. The flint freshly sharpened in the lock mechanism, guaranteeing an intense spark. The pan cleaned with a grain of fine powder for instantaneous ignition. Everything ready. First contact. The first direct visual contact with the enemy always produced an adrenaline surge that Miguel had learned to control. He observed through the trees the French vanguard entering the ambush sector, mounted dragoons with their green helmets shining dimly under sunlight filtered through foliage, carbines hanging carelessly from saddles. Behind them, infantry in column of 4s, muskets on shoulders, conversing relaxed. These soldiers had won battles from the Danube to the Tagus. Their arrogance was understandable. They didn't expect serious resistance on a secondary road in broad daylight. The officers rode in the center of the formation, identifiable by their superior mounts in the erect posture of those who had never known strategic defeat. Miguel identified his target, the commanding general mounted on a dapple-gray horse, conversing animatedly with the younger captain. The first shot. He waited. The hunter's patience was crucial. He let half the column enter completely into the kill zone. He wanted escape to be difficult, panic to propagate in both directions. He calculated the distance, 240 meters to his target. Wind was minimal, blowing slightly left to right, requiring half-meter correction. Temperature was cool but not cold, standard air density for the altitude. The French general stopped momentarily, turning his head to give an order. Perfect, a stationary profile target. He inhaled deeply, exhaled half the air, held, and gently pressed the trigger. The lock mechanism released the flint against the frizzen, generating sparks that ignited the pan powder, which in turn transmitted fire to the main charge. The rifle roared, recoiling against his shoulder with familiar force. White smoke momentarily obscured his vision. The projectile left the barrel at 400 meters per second, spinning like a lethal top. In the half-second it took to cover the distance to his target, General Dufour had begun turning toward his aide, completely oblivious to the death approaching. The bullet, maintaining its trajectory with surgical precision thanks to gyroscopic stabilization, struck Captain Mercier in the forehead, penetrating the frontal bone, devastating the brain, and exiting through the back of the skull in a crimson cloud. The body collapsed from the horse before the sound of the shot reached French ears. The cascade of death. 2 seconds later, Juan Herrera's rifle found its mark. A lieutenant fell with his chest pierced. Then Pedro Gavilan eliminated a sergeant major. In 15 seconds, 6 French officers and non-commissioned officers lay dead or dying, and the column still hadn't identified where the fire was coming from. Panic manifested exactly as Miguel had anticipated. French soldiers, disciplined veterans in conventional battle, found themselves disoriented before an invisible enemy that killed with supernatural precision. Dragoons speared their mounts toward the trees, seeking to identify the attackers. But dense vegetation and the elevated positions of Spanish marksmen made visual location impossible. A corporal attempted to organize a line of fusiliers to return fire, but another deadly whistle dropped him before completing the order. The futile response. French Charleville muskets began firing toward the forest in uncoordinated bursts, bullets whistling harmlessly among branches or impacting trunks, dozens of meters from the Spanish marksmen. The distance, insignificant for rifled muskets, was abysmal for smooth-bore weapons. It was like trying to hit a fly with a stone thrown blindly. Miguel reloaded methodically, without haste. He extracted the ramrod from its housing under the barrel, cleaned powder residue with 2 quick passes, poured new charge from his measuring horn, introduced a fresh projectile, compacted everything with firm but not excessive pressure, primed the pen. 40 seconds. Meanwhile, his companions continued firing in staggered sequence, maintaining constant pressure. Every 5 seconds, another Frenchman fell. The tactic was devastatingly effective. Don't permit the enemy to reorganize. Maintain psychological chaos. Erode command structure. The 4, finally comprehending the magnitude of danger, shouted orders for the column to retreat, but confusion reigned. Some soldiers advanced toward the forest, others retreated. Formation disintegrated into isolated groups seeking individual cover.
The psychological impact. The technological superiority of the Spanish rifled musket manifested in multiple dimensions. It wasn't just long-distance precision, it was the multiplied psychological effect. An army could absorb casualties from artillery fire or cavalry charges. These were comprehensible events within war's logic. But this silent, surgical death that selected specific officers from impossible distances corroded morale profoundly. French soldiers began understanding their weapons were useless against his enemy. They fired hundreds of shots without effect, while each Spanish shot found flesh. The asymmetry was terrifying. A veteran sergeant decorated at Austerlitz found himself trembling behind an oak, tears of frustration running down his dusty face, completely conscious of his impotence. Before we continue to the decisive hours, and believe me, what happened next changed the course of the entire war, we want to know, from what city or country are you watching us? Write it in the comments. If you want more detailed war stories like this, subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell. A like helps these important historical events reach more people. Now let's return to that fateful moment. Phase 2. The capture. After 15 minutes of unilateral fire, Miguel ordered halt. The French column had lost 23 men, including 9 officers. Survivors had dispersed into a chaotic defensive perimeter, using rocks and trees as improvised parapets. It was time for the second phase. Miguel emitted the agreed signal, 3 short woodpecker whistles. From closer positions, less than 50 meters, 60 additional guerrillas with conventional weapons emerged from the forest. They didn't seek prolonged confrontation. Their objective was the treasure cart the French had abandoned in their disordered retreat. 20 men ran toward the vehicle, while another 40 provided covering fire. The French, still stunned, responded weakly. In 3 minutes, the Spanish had hitched mules to the cart and were dragging it toward the mountains. The failed counterattack. Dufour attempted to organize a counteroffensive. He gathered 40 soldiers and personally led a charge toward the last known marksman positions. It was a brave decision, but futile. By the time they reached the firing positions, the Spanish had vanished like smoke, using mountain trails only locals knew, carrying their precious rifles and leaving only lead casings as evidence of their presence. The French general observed the empty trees, impotence burning in his chest. He had lost a third of his officers, the entire treasure, and worst of all, the absolute certainty that his troops were superior. The aftermath. That afternoon, while organizing evacuation of the wounded and collection of the dead, Dufour would write in his personal diary, "We face today an enemy who possesses a weapon that makes our tactics obsolete. If this becomes widespread, Spain will be invincible." The French retreat was slow and humiliating. They transported 14 corpses and 9 seriously wounded in carts requisitioned from a nearby village. Soldiers marched in silence, a very different attitude than the morning's arrogance. Each creak of the forest made them tense, expecting another deadly whistle. Miguel and his marksmen watched from a distant ridge, satisfied but not celebrating. They knew this tactical victory would provoke strategic responses. The French would study what happened, develop countermeasures, perhaps acquire their own rifled muskets. The technological advantage was temporary, but for now, on this October day in 1811, they had demonstrated something crucial, that superior technology in the hands of a few experts could defeat conventional numerical force. The ripple effect. The critical decisions made that day would resonate far beyond the individual encounter. Dufour's report would reach Paris, where French military engineers would begin urgent experiments with barrel rifling. But mass production of rifled muskets faced insurmountable obstacles with 1811 technology. They required expert craftsmen, excessive time, prohibitive costs. Spain, with its tradition of individual blacksmiths and decentralized production, was paradoxically better positioned to manufacture these weapons than the industrialized French Empire with its massive but standardized arsenals. The spread of the legend. The news of the Guadarrama ambush spread through Spain with the speed of wildfire. In Andalusian taverns, peasants whispered about the magical rifle that killed Frenchmen at impossible distances. In the salons of Cadiz, where the Cortes debated the Constitution, deputies demanded information about these miraculous weapons. In Navarre's guerrilla headquarters, commanders sent urgent emissaries to Oviedo begging access to Rodriguez rifles.
The master gunsmith, overwhelmed by impossible demands, could only reiterate reality. His workshop produced 4 rifles monthly. There was no way to accelerate production without sacrificing the precision that made them effective. Each rifle required individually forged barrels, rifling carved with infinite patience, personal calibration by the master. Industrial mass warfare collided with medieval artisanal art. The French response was swift. Marshal Massena, humiliated by growing losses, implemented drastic countermeasures. He ordered all moving columns to include elite marksmen, tirailleurs, advancing in dispersed formation 200 meters ahead of the main force, specifically to detect ambushes. He prohibited officers from wearing distinctive uniforms in hostile terrain. Bicorns were replaced by common hats, golden epaulets concealed under capes. He established a policy of collective reprisals. For each French officer killed in ambush,
10 Spanish civilians from the nearest town would be executed. This brutality, far from intimidating the population, intensified their support for guerrillas. Villages organized alert systems with bell towers. Peasants risked their lives hiding weapons and ammunition. Spanish women acted as couriers carrying information between guerrilla bands. Evolution of tactics. Miguel Santana and his group continued operations during the following months, but tactics evolved. The French were learning. It was no longer possible to repeat simple ambushes on secondary roads. Columns traveled with experienced scouts who examined every forest, every ridge, every potential sniper position. Dragoons performed aggressive sweeps before allowing infantry to advance. The Spanish advantage eroded, not because the rifles lost effectiveness, but because the enemy adapted tactics. Miguel had to become more cunning. Nocturnal ambushes, impossible with muskets, but viable with precision rifles at moderate distances. Attacks from urban positions, firing from building windows in momentarily liberated towns. Pure sniper tactics. A single shooter, one high-value casualty, immediate escape. The strategic shift. The decisive actions of this period fundamentally changed the nature of the Peninsular War. French generals began experiencing what modern military historians would call asymmetric warfare, and technologically and numerically inferior enemy compensating through terrain knowledge, popular support, and localized technical superiority. Napoleon in Paris, receiving increasingly alarming reports from Spain, wrote in January 1812, "Spain is an ulcer that consumes our forces." He didn't fully comprehend what part of that ulcer was technological. While France produced thousands of standardized muskets monthly at Saint-Étienne, Spain manufactured dozens of superior artisanal rifles. In terms of industrial production, France dominated overwhelmingly. But in specific tactical effectiveness, Spanish rifles provided a force multiplier disproportionate to their number. The unsung hero. The heroism of these months wasn't limited to the marksman. Antonio Rodriguez worked 18 hours daily in his forge, his hands covered with calluses and burns, knowing each completed rifle could save dozens of Spanish lives. His son, Javier Rodriguez, 21 years old, had assumed auxiliary tasks, forging projectiles, preparing powder, polishing stocks. The workshop operated in absolute secrecy. If the French discovered its location, they would send overwhelming forces to destroy it. Rodriguez had developed contingencies, dismountable furnaces, tools hidden in multiple locations, capability to evacuate in 2 hours and reestablish production at another site. The personal sacrifice was immense. He rejected orders for ceremonial weapons from wealthy nobles that would have provided him fortune. Every minute, every gram of metal, every spark from his forge was dedicated exclusively to the War of Independence.
The psychological toll. The immediate consequences of the sniper campaign manifested on multiple levels. Psychologically, French troops in Spain developed what period military doctors called shattered nerves, what we would today recognize as post-traumatic stress. Veteran soldiers who had marched impassively towards Austrian cannons found themselves terrified of apparently empty Spanish forests. Desertion rates increased dramatically. In February 1812, the 45th Regiment of the Line lost 120 men, not to combat, but to deserters who simply disappeared during night marches, preferring to risk the firing squad rather than another day in the mountains where invisible death lurked. Strategic resource drain. Strategically, the French had to dedicate disproportionate resources to protecting communication lines. Convoys that previously required 100 escorts now needed 300. Every letter, every message, every supply shipment required significant military protection. The demonstration. In March 1812, a singular event demonstrated the full extent of the rifled musket's impact. General Bertrand Clausel, commander of the Army of the North, organized an experimental demonstration in Burgos. He gathered 50 elite French marksmen, the army's best, armed with standard Charleville muskets. He ordered them to fire at human-sized targets at 200 meters. Of 500 total shots, only 17 hit the targets, a precision rate of 3.4%. Then Clausel brought out 3 guerrilla prisoners captured with Spanish rifle muskets. Under guard, he allowed them to fire at the same target. The 3 guerrillas, using rifles they had never fired before, achieved 11 hits out of 15 shots, 73% accuracy. The French officers present observed in stunned silence. It wasn't a question of shooter skill. It was absolute technological superiority. Clausel urgently wrote to Paris requesting engineers to replicate the Spanish design. The industrial limitation. The French attempt to produce rifled muskets revealed the limitations of their industrial model. The imperial arsenals of Charleville, Maubeuge, and Saint-Étienne were optimized for standardized mass production. Workers were operatives specialized in specific repetitive tasks, not integral craftsmen. No one in these arsenals possessed the complete knowledge to create consistent rifling without specialized machinery that didn't yet exist. The experimental prototypes produced in Paris during 1812 showed irregular precision. Some worked well, others were as imprecise as conventional muskets. The problem lay in microscopic tolerances. If the rifling was too deep, the bullet lost velocity. Too shallow, it didn't engage correctly. The depth had to be exact, 0.5 millimeters, and uniform along 80 centimeters of barrel. Rodriguez achieved this through tactile experience accumulated over 20 years. French engineers attempted to replicate it through theoretical calculations that didn't capture the practical subtleties of the art. The most dangerous mission. The most intense moment of the rifled musket campaign came in June 1812, when Miguel Santana received the most dangerous mission of his life. Spanish intelligence had intercepted French communications, revealing that Marshal Marmont, supreme commander of the Army of Portugal, would travel from Salamanca to Valladolid with minimal escort, relying on speed to avoid detection. It was an extraordinary opportunity. Eliminating a marshal of the empire, one of the 30 most militarily powerful men in Europe, would dramatically change the strategic balance, but the risk was proportional. If he failed, if he was captured, the French would torture him for days to extract information about the rifles and then execute him publicly to intimidate other guerrillas. Miguel Santana accepted the mission with full awareness of the consequences. Meticulous preparation. The preparation was meticulous. Miguel spent 4 days studying the probable route, identifying 20 possible ambush locations. Finally, he selected a stone bridge over the Duero River, narrow, forcing any carriage to reduce speed. The shooting position was a Roman ruin on a hill 200 meters away, offering clear line of sight and multiple escape routes toward vineyards covering the slopes. He arrived 36 hours before Marmont's estimated passage time, building a fortified position with stones, studying the light at different hours, calculating wind angles. The rifle was cleaned and recalibrated. He prepared 20 projectiles, each personally inspected, discarding any with microscopic imperfections. He filled 3 powder horns with superior quality mixture, guaranteeing consistent power. He verified the flint, replacing it with a new one, although the previous one worked perfectly. There could be no margin for error.
The critical moment. On June 14th at 3 p.m., dust on the horizon announced the convoy's approach. Miguel observed through his spyglass. 3 carriages, 30 dragoons as escort, advancing at moderate speed. The central carriage had red velvet curtains, symbol of high rank. Miguel calculated times. The convoy would take 8 minutes to reach the bridge. He adopted firing position.
rifle resting on a stone parapet, cheek against the stock, controlled breathing. The convoy approached. 6 minutes. The dragoons casually explored the terrain. They didn't expect danger on such a well-traveled route. 4 minutes. The carriage began reducing speed for the bridge. 2 minutes. Miguel could see the driver, the draft horses, the wooden wheels with iron reinforcements. 1 minute. The carriage was on the bridge, momentarily stopped by civilian traffic congestion, crossing in the opposite direction. The carriage curtain opened. A man in dark blue uniform with marshal's insignia partially emerged, shouting impatient orders at the driver. It was Marmont. Miguel identified him from intelligence reports. Angular face, carefully groomed black mustache, scar on left cheek from a previous campaign. Distance, 223 meters. Light northwest wind requiring minimal correction. Target partially exposed. Only upper torso and head visible from the carriage window. Miguel exhaled slowly, his finger caressing the trigger with gradually increasing pressure. The world reduced to that moment. Him, the rifle, the target. He pressed. The shot that almost changed everything. The shot was technically perfect, but fate intervened cruelly. In the fraction of a second between the shot and impact, Marmont turned abruptly to speak with someone inside the carriage. The projectile destined for his chest struck his right shoulder instead of his heart. The marshal fell backward inside the carriage, gravely wounded, but alive. The dragoons reacted instantly, galloping full speed toward the hill. Miguel had no time for a second shot. He abandoned the position, running toward the vineyards while carbine bullets whistled around him. The dragoons were fast, too fast. They reached the ruin in 90 seconds, finding only the abandoned rifle. Miguel couldn't carry it during the flight. It reduced speed crucially. They followed his trail into the vineyards, but Miguel knew every path, every refuge. He disappeared into the rural labyrinth. At this point in the battle, and before I explain the final consequences of this operation, let's build a community. Where are you from? Spain? Mexico? Argentina? Colombia? Or somewhere else? Share your thoughts on this historic battle. If you appreciate this content, support us with a subscription. Let's continue with the dramatic consequences. The strategic consequences. Although he failed to kill Marmont, the wound had significant strategic consequences. The marshal was evacuated to France for treatment, absent during critical months. His temporary replacement, General Clausel, lacked his experience and authority. More importantly, the incident confirmed to the French that no commander was safe in Spain. If a marshal of the empire could be struck on a supposedly safe route, anyone was vulnerable. The psychological effect was devastating for French officer morale. Generals began traveling only at night, using carriages without insignia, constantly changing routes. Paranoia became operational standard. The final tally. The final result of the rifled musket campaign between October 1811 and July 1812 was mixed but significant. Spanish marksmen had eliminated approximately 200 French officers, a relatively small number in a war involving hundreds of thousands of soldiers. But the impact was disproportionate because these weren't random casualties. They were experienced commanders, battalion leaders, company captains, operational brains of the army. Replacing them required time. New officers lacked knowledge of Spanish terrain and experience in guerrilla warfare. French operational effectiveness degraded monthly. Beyond the Spanish theater, the strategic consequences resonated beyond the Spanish theater. Reports about rifled muskets reached London, where the British Army initiated its own experimental programs. In 1800, Colonel Patrick Ferguson had already developed a breech-loading rifled musket for the British, but limited production and his death in 1780 had ended the project. Now, with renewed evidence of effectiveness, the British resumed research. This would culminate in 1853 with the Enfield rifled musket, standard weapon of the British Empire for decades. The Americans also took notice. During the Civil War of 1861 to 1865,
Rifled muskets would completely transform military tactics, making massive frontal charges obsolete. The lessons learned. The post-war military analysis of the rifled musket campaign revealed crucial lessons about technology and warfare. First, localized technological advantage can compensate for numerical inferiority if applied intelligently.
Second, industrial superiority doesn't guarantee innovation superiority. Sometimes artisanal traditions produce advances that mass factories cannot quickly replicate. Third, the psychological factor of new weaponry can exceed its material impact. The terror generated by invisible snipers affected morale more deeply than numerically equivalent casualties in conventional battle. The historical legacy. The historical impact of Spanish rifled muskets transcended the specific conflict of the Independence War. When French troops finally evacuated Spain in 1814, they carried not only traumatic memories of relentless guerrillas, but also technical knowledge about armament that would revolutionize modern warfare. French military engineers who had attempted to replicate Rodriguez's rifles returned to Paris with notebooks full of observations, measurements, and diagrams. This knowledge fed decades of ballistics research. By 1840, France had developed the Minié rifle, which incorporated rifling principles into mass production, eventually arming millions of soldiers in subsequent wars. The seed planted in Oviedo's artisanal forges germinated in industrial arsenals that completely transformed infantry combat's nature. Echoes through military academies. The lessons learned from this campaign resonated in military academies for generations. Prussian officers studying at the Kriegsakademie in Berlin analyzed Spanish reports as case studies in asymmetric warfare. Americans preparing for their own civil war recognized that precision rifles would fundamentally change battle tactics. It would no longer be possible to form dense infantry lines marching toward the enemy. Snipers would decimate them before they reached effective range. Dispersed formations, trenches, and movement warfare would become necessary. World War I, with its lethal snipers and kill zones created by precise fire, was a direct descendant of tactics developed in the Spanish mountains of 1811. The generals who ordered suicidal charges at Verdun and the Somme would have avoided unnecessary massacres if they had fully understood the lessons Miguel Santana and his companions taught the French a century earlier. The forgotten memory. The memory and monuments related to rifled muskets are curiously scarce. In Spain, there are no statues of Antonio Rodriguez, whose artisanal genius provided crucial force multipliers. There are no museums dedicated to preserving these historic rifles. Most were lost during subsequent conflicts or melted down when they became obsolete. Only a few specimens survive in private collections and European military museums, recognized by specialists but ignored by the general public. This historical amnesia reflects a broader pattern. Spanish technological innovations of the era tend to be eclipsed by narratives emphasizing individual heroism over technical ingenuity. Brave guerrillas charging Frenchmen with knives are celebrated, but the meticulous gunsmith creating technological advantages that saved many more lives than any individual act of bravery is forgotten. The Lost Workshop. In Oviedo, the location of Rodriguez's workshop is now a modern apartment building. A small plaque installed in 1995 by local military history enthusiasts briefly mentions that on this site, an armory workshop operated during the Independence War. It doesn't mention names, doesn't explain historical significance, doesn't capture the irony that here, in a 30-square-meter space, weapons were forged that terrorized the most powerful army in Europe. Tourists pass daily without a second glance. Building residents mostly don't know the legacy they walk upon. Only each May 2nd, when Spain commemorates the uprising against the French, do some local historians organize small ceremonies remembering the forgotten gunsmiths of the Independence War. Miguel's survival and descent. Miguel Santana survived the war, a remarkable achievement considering active guerrillas' life expectancy was barely 14 months. In 1814, at age 37, he returned to his native Asturian village. The rifled musket that had accompanied him for 3 years was confiscated by reorganized Spanish military authorities, supposedly for technical analysis, but it really disappeared into bureaucracy. Miguel never recovered it. He attempted to resume his life as a hunter, but the mountains he once loved now haunted him with memories. Every forest recalled ambushes, every ridge sniper positions, every distant silhouette French officers in his sights. He developed what period doctors called profound melancholy, severe depression with acute anxiety episodes. He died in 1829 at age 52, from causes parish records list as prolonged fever, but family testimony suggests suicide by poison. His grave in the village cemetery doesn't mention his military service. The simple inscription reads, Miguel Santana, hunter, husband, father. Rest in peace.
Rodriguez's bitter peace. Antonio Rodriguez continued his craft after the war, but never again manufactured military rifles. Demand disappeared once the French evacuated. Subsequent Spanish governments, perpetually underfunded, couldn't pay for expensive artisanal weapons when cheap muskets imported from England were available. Rodriguez returned to making hunting rifles for nobles, work he hated for its decorative frivolity compared to war's existential urgency. He trained his son Javier in rifling techniques, ensuring the knowledge wouldn't be lost. Javier, however, emigrated to France in 1825, where he worked in Saint Etienne's arsenals, an ironic circle where Spanish techniques perfected to kill Frenchmen now armed the French army. Rodriguez died in 1838, at age 78 in his workshop, hammer in hand, working on his last rifle. The obituary in the local newspaper mentioned his exceptional craftsmanship, but completely omitted his contribution to national independence. A reflective conclusion. The reflective conclusion of this story is ambivalent. Spanish rifled muskets represent the triumph of ingenuity over resources, quality over quantity, decentralized innovation over mass production. They demonstrated that small groups with superior technology and intelligent tactics can impact conflicts that seem dominated by large armies. But they also revealed the limitations of temporary technological advantages. By 1815, the knowledge had diffused. By 1850, rifled muskets were standard in major European armies. Spain's 1811 advantage evaporated within a generation. Moreover, the story shows how crucial military innovations are frequently forgotten by societies that prefer narratives of individual heroism over complex technical narratives. The names of French generals defeated in Spain are well known. The name of Antonio Rodriguez, whose creations defeated them, is forgotten outside specialized circles. The ultimate truth. Perhaps the final lesson is that war, regardless of technology or tactics, is fundamentally human tragedy. Rifled muskets killed efficiently, but each bullet found human flesh. Young Frenchmen forcibly conscripted, far from their farms in Normandy or Provence, dying in Spanish mountains for imperial ambitions they didn't share. The Spanish marksmen, though justly defending their land, carried permanent psychological trauma from killing dozens of men from safe distance. A dehumanization that hand-to-hand combat, however brutal, at least didn't impose. The deadly precision of the Spanish rifled musket saved Spain from permanent occupation, but at a cost in lives, mental health, and shared humanity that no strategic victory can completely justify. The end.